Hey guys, and welcome to another Mammoth Interactive tutorial on elements of the Swift 3 programming language. So our focus in this tutorial will be on variables and how to declare them, initialize them, use them, and exactly what they are. So we're just in the playground file. I opened up Xcode and I said create a new playground, and this is a file that I'm in right now. So this is what the default screen looks like. It automatically gives us a string variable. Import UI kit, and it gives us this definition here, place where people can play. So really it's just an environment that allows you to kind of write code, test code, and really it's more to play around than to do app development. For the app development parts, we'll actually be using a different type of Xcode file, but we'll get more into that later. So for now our focus is on variables. And what exactly is a variable, you might ask? Well, a variable is basically just kind of an item that can contain a value. And variables can change their value, as their name would imply. That's why they're variable. And we'll look at something else briefly, which is called a constant. Constants are similar to variables except that they cannot change their values. So they can still hold values and they have a type, but they cannot change it. So let's write a quick definition here. So variables are items that have a name, a type, and a value, which can be changed. So the name and the type of the variable cannot be changed once they've been assigned. In order to do that, in order to change the type, we would have to convert it and store it in a different variable. Okay, so once a variable has a name and a type, that can't be changed. However, the value can be changed, okay, which is why it's a variable. Whereas constants are items, basically constants are variables that cannot, whose value cannot be changed. How about that? Whose value cannot be changed. Okay, so let's take a brief look at an example of a variable, or rather how to set a variable up. So we'll call variable, and this is a Swift variable declaration, and it gives us a name and a value. Okay, so don't worry about these errors that come up. This is just because we haven't given something an actual name or a value. So we'll have a variable name and some kind of value that it can hold. So variable value. Okay, so usually, and for the sakes of, for the purposes of these tutorials, I'm going to try and include a type as much as possible. They'll have a type. So the way we do that is we just say type here, and then we can give it a value. So we can choose to give a variable a type or not, and we can choose to give a variable a value or not. Okay, but it has to have a name, and it will have an implied type. So if we don't specify a type, well, I mean, we always have to give a type, but if we don't specify one and give a value, then it will automatically assume the type that that value contains. So for example, if this value is a 1 or a 2, the variable name will this variable called variable name will automatically take on the type integer. If it's a string value, then it will take on the type string. If it's a Boolean value, it would take on the type Boolean, okay? So we don't always need to specify the type as long as we have a variable value. Just like we don't have to specify the value if we have a type. Okay, so there's a few different elements to look at with variables, but basically they all have this form where we have a name. I'm just going to write out the different forms so we can have some name. Let's just call this name1, and we can have a type. Oh, we don't want OS type. Just call it that. And then we can have name2, where we have no type, but we have a value. And then let's just call this name3, where we have a type and a value. Okay, now if we're not going to give it a type, let's see what this error tells us. Use of undeclared, oh right, because it's not actually a real type. So if we were to give this a type like int or something, then that should be fine. So right now it doesn't contain a value because we haven't given it one. but that's fine. It's we can choose to give a variable a value or not. Just know that if you don't give a variable a value and try to use it later on, it will probably throw an error saying that you haven't given it a value yet. Okay, so we can either have a type, or we can have a value, or we can have a type and a value, but it always needs to follow this convention. Okay, so there are many different types. A lot of them are built-in types. The most common ones that we'll use, I'm just going to write the comment, common types will be ints or integers, floats and doubles. We'll have strings, we'll have booleans, and we'll have characters. So these will be the common ones that we'll focus on. These will be the main focus of this tutorial. So ints, floats, and doubles. These are all number representations. Strings are good for like texts and messages. Booleans are either true or false variables, and characters are kind of like strings but of length 1. Okay, so single unit items. Okay, so this is a basic intro to variables. Constants are similar. I'll just give you a brief rundown of a constant. Constants are called the same way as variables, except we have a let instead of a variable name, but then we have some kind of name 3 and then some some value here. Okay, the difference is that we could change this value of name 1, but we cannot, I should name this name 4, but we cannot change the value of name 4 because it's a let constant. Okay, so constants are good for assigning values to items which you know will never need to change. If you think it might change, declare it to be a variable. Okay, so that's variables and constants for you. We'll get started off with integers and then we'll explore the other types, and yeah, so hopefully by the end you guys will be experts. Alright, so enjoy this tutorial, hope you learn a lot. Okay, so this part is going to give us an intro into booleans. So we're going to first discuss exactly what a boolean is and where we can use them in the code. So booleans are true or false values, and they're good for basically part variables in the code where we can only take on one of two values. So very useful for running tests. Also, we're going to look at some examples of booleans in real life. So we'll have an example of an isLoggedIn variable and of an isDoorClosedUp variable. But we'll get more into that in the video itself. Alright, welcome to the Boolean portion of our tutorial, where we're going to introduce and discuss the variable and constant type Boolean. Now, in this we're going to introduce what a Boolean is, and then we're also going to discuss some examples and where we use them. Okay, so these two lines I just put in comments here. You see they're in green and they're after these double slashes. This just means that they are kind of text, they're ignored by the compiler, so they don't carry any kind of meaning. They're just there for us to refer back to. Okay, so what is a Boolean exactly? Well, a Boolean can take on it can be either true or false. Okay, so it can have either one of two states. So if you think about a binary number, well, binaries are just zeros and ones, so you can only have two states. It can be either a 0 or a 1, but never both, and never anything else. It's a little like a Boolean. So for example, I'll just create some variables here. So let's call this variable isTrue, and we're going to declare it of type Boolean. So notice this kind of drop-down menu comes up and gives us a few suggestions. The one we're going to be using is the one at the very top, which is the capital B-O-O-L, short for Boolean. And we're just going to initialize this to be true. And as you can see, we get the value true printed here. Okay, and that's because, well, we declared this variable of type Boolean and assigned it the value true. If we try to, and here let's create one that's called false. So this one's going to be isFalse. So type Boolean, and we'll give it the value false. And just waiting for it to update. There we go. So we get false written there. So again, either true or false. See what happens if we try to give it a different value. So Let's call this different bool, and we'll try and give it the type boolean, and let's give it a 5. So let's see, yeah, here we get an error, and we click on it, it says we cannot convert type int to specified type boolean. So we know booleans can only contain true or false values. Now we could just assign a value to this, for example true, without declaring it of a type boolean, and the compiler automatically knows that it's a boolean and will return true. But for the purposes of these tutorials, we'll be specific and declare the types right after the variable. Okay, so the way we've set this up is it's a variable, not a constant. We have a name here. We've given it we put the colon, and then we've given it a type, and then we've assigned a value here. Okay, so again, the type is optional, but recommended in this case until you feel comfortable enough with all the different variable types. Now we've just created a few different variables. We can also create constant booleans. So the way we do that is we have the let, and then we'll create this one called constant bool, and we'll give it the type boolean, and let's give it the value 5. Or there's a boolean, so let's give it the value false, not 5. Okay, so it's taken on the value false down there. Now the difference between the constants and the variables is that the variables can be reassigned, so that's where the name comes from. They're variable, which means they can take on different values according to what you last assigned it, whereas constants, once declared, can only contain that one value. So let me show you what I mean. If we reassign different bool, and it just appeared on the drop-down menu there. If we give it the value false down here, then we get false being printed, and then if I print just the value of different bool, then what do we get printed out? Just wait for it to update. And while it does that, oh, here we go, and we get false. Okay, so that's because we've reassigned it down here. So it started off with the value true, so different bool contained the value true up here, but down here we reassigned it the value false, and then when we call on it, it contains a value false. Okay, whereas with the constant, if we try to reassign it, so constant bool, let's say equals, we have it false to start off with, let's give it the value true and see what happens. Here we go, we get a little error here saying we cannot assign the value because it is a constant. Okay, so moral of the story here is constant values cannot take on new, or constant variables cannot take on new values, whereas the variables can. So they can be reassigned. Okay, so that's the difference between the two. Another thing to note is the semicolons here. You can include them if you want. I'm just including them out of habit because most of the languages I code with need semicolons, but it's fine to exclude them. The only time in Swift 3 that they really come in handy is if we want more than one thing on one line. So for example, if we wanted this all to be on one line, then that's fine. Okay, as long as it's separated by the semicolon. Okay, so again, optional or not, it doesn't really matter. So that's what a boolean is. It can contain either a true or a false value, and we can assign it in one of two ways. We can either explicitly give it either a true or false, or we can do this. So let's call this one true statement, and this will be a type boolean, and we'll give it the value 5 equals 5. So rather than calling it true and giving it the true value, I've given it a statement which is true. So 5 does equal 5, they're the same number, and so it takes on the value of true. And so if we were to print out true statement here, and I'm just selecting it from the drop-down menu, let's see what kind of value we get. And it's just updating there. And yeah, we see we get true because we've assigned it to be a true statement. Okay, so it doesn't take on any kind of value of 5. It just takes on the fact, or it interprets this as being true because it is a true statement, and so it's given that value. We can do the same with false, so let's call this false statement. And again of type Boolean, and we're going to give it something like 4 equals 7. And let's have it being printed here, false statement. And you see we get the value false both times there, because 4 does not equal 7, and that's what we've assigned false statement to contain the value of. Okay, so basically we can assign values in one of two ways. We can either give it a true or false explicitly here, or we can give it a true or false statement implicitly as seen here. So we have a true statement, so it takes on true, false statement, so it takes on false. Okay, so those are two different ways to represent Boolean values. Now we've introduced what a Boolean is, so let's take a look at some of the examples and where we might use them in code or see them in real life. I've already given you the example of binary numbers where it's either 0 or 1, and actually some compilers interpret Booleans that way. So the C++ compiler, for example, if you get it to print out a Boolean that's false, will print out a 0, whereas a true Boolean will print out a 1. Okay, so that's just the way that compiler interprets it. In this case, we actually get true or false printed out. Now, another good example I like to use is the example of an account. So an account will have some kind of credentials, such as a username or password, to log in. And once you're logged into your account, you can access the whole thing. So let's create this variable isLoggedIn, and it's going to be of type Boolean, and we'll just initialize it to be false. So in this case, we have this isLoggedIn variable, and we're giving it the value false, which means we're not logged in. So this means that we are not in our account and we won't be able to access anything. However, if this is changed to true, so let's say we entered our credentials correctly, then we get the value changed from false to true. Okay, and then we could probably access the rest of our account. So that's a good example of where we'll have Booleans in code. So anything with an account might have anything under this condition. So if isLoggedIn is true, then you can access your account, you can do all this stuff, whereas if isLoggedIn is false, you can't do anything. Okay, so that's one example. Another example might be in elevator. So elevators are computerized, there's programming behind them too. So we'll have this variable isDoorClosed, and we'll give it the type Boolean, and we'll just give it the value true for now. So an elevator is programmed to not move or not be able to move if the doors are open. So it only starts moving once these doors are closed. Now, how does it determine if the doors are closed? Well, perhaps there'll be some kind of a variable that is changed once the doors are fully closed and the sensors know that. So there might be this variable isDoorClosed, and the elevator won't move until this variable is true. Okay, whereas if this variable is false, the elevator won't move. Okay, so there's a couple examples of where you might see Booleans in code. So isLoggedIn in an account, and isDoorClosed in an elevator. Okay, so that pretty much sums up all we have to say about Booleans. Just to recap what we learned that Booleans can take on either true or false values. We can explicitly give them either a true or a false, or we can implicitly give them a statement. So there's a true statement, so it will take on a true value. Here's a false statement, it will take on a false value. And just one thing to note the double equals here. So a single equals is for assignment, whereas the double equals is for comparison. So in this case, we're comparing these two. Is 5 equal to 5? Whereas this is saying this is equal to this, okay? So use the double equals when comparing, single equals when assigning. Okay, so yeah, again, we can give it either a true or false statement and it'll take on those values. We learned that we can reassign them down here. For example, we started off with different bool being true and then gave it the false value, but only with variables, so constants cannot be reassigned. And we went over a couple of examples of an isLoggedIn that won't let us access an account unless it's true, and the isDoorClosed, which won't let an elevator move until it's true. Okay, so that's booleans for you. Our next part will be looking at integers. Okay, so this has been our intro into booleans. Now, booleans are, just to recap, either true or false variables or constants, and they can be either explicitly or implicitly assigned. So we can either directly call it to be true or false, or we can pass it a statement that is either true or false, and it will take on true or false depending on the outcome of that statement. Okay, so the examples we used are an account login. So perhaps we have an isLoggedIn variable that won't give us access to an account unless it's true, and an elevator door closed programming. So basically the elevator won't be able to move until the isDoorClosed variable is true. Okay, so these are some examples of where you'd see it in real life. And this next part we'll be taking a look at integers.